Good afternoon. Thanks for coming to the talk. This talk's going to go through nearly 3 decades of application security that I've been quite happy to be involved in. And I've seen how the industry's changed quite a bit from the early days of the 90s into where we're at now when it comes to application security. And I thought there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from 26, 27 years of applications evolving from the start of the World Wide Web into what we have today. Now, I think it's important to set the scene. Right at the start of, say, the early World Wide Web, a lot of the research that was happening was still looking at the network layer. Now, this was important because the internet was coming alive and people were putting boxes online, and there was this real sense of if we build it, we can make these e-commerce sites and so on. A big milestone in the history of application security happened in 1998 when a gentleman called Rainforest Puppy published the now legendary paper that looked at the research he was doing at the time in a Microsoft product called SQL Server. Now, what he found was that SQL itself, right, allowed batch commands. And what that meant is you could piggyback SQL commands into doing something really bad. Now, why this was important around 98 was that a lot of people were building web applications that made use of this new SQL database to store data, and the Apache or whatever you were using at the time would query that data source to pull data out. Now, when he did the responsible disclosure, yes, even back then, and responded to Microsoft, their answer was, well, according to them, it's not really a problem, right? So we're not going to worry about it. We're not going to try and stop it, or, what's the worst that could happen? Now, it's important to set the scene. At the time, a lot of security vendors were selling products that stopped attackers from breaking web applications, right? For example, Checkpoint was one of them. They promised that their firewall would stop these hackers breaking into applications. Now, what was weirdly ironic about that at the time was that port 80 had to be open for everybody to gain access to the web application, and therein lies the problem. Now, this definitely wasn't the first time a security researcher went to a vendor to say, hey, I found a problem, it could be bad. I have personally experienced this myself. 4 years ago, we released a tool called Ruler. And Ruler was a tool to abuse Microsoft Exchange services. We found a serious flaw with Exchange and how Outlook handled its rules. And we created the tool to give awareness. And Microsoft at the time decided it wasn't a security issue, right? It was a feature. Don't worry about it. Well, it was bad because we could add malicious rules without the user knowing. And it got so bad that even APT33, which is Iranian threat group, used it to carry out numerous operations. So what Rainforest Puppy did with SQL Server and SQL injection kind of set the scene. Now, it's important to show that before that, when we were looking at a lot of web application flaws, they were always concentrating on the daemons or the OS itself. So, for example, you had the early versions of Apache and the chunk encoding. And indeed, a lot of things were down to input validation. And on the right is some of the tools that I helped build for a company I used to run called SensePost. And this was how you used to gain access to a lot of applications back in the day. This was kind of the first real application hacking scene. In this case, you had to find the web root, right? You needed to launch your Perl script, because back then we used to write exploits because that was cool. We would upload our ASP files and upload netcat.exe, and then we would connect to it and we'd have a reverse shell. Right? And this was really good. And indeed, if you look at the late 90s, early 2000s, 2001, a lot of web applications that were hacked back then were due to either poorly managed operating systems or just pretty bad OSs and daemons that were never really built to do secure computing. And this was important because what followed next kind of set the scene for how the security industry started to build more robust things. Now, on the 15th of January, 2002, at exactly 5:22 p.m. PST, Bill Gates sent a now legendary memo called Trustworthy Computing. Now, this was really important because Bill at the time had gone through a bit of a bad patch with Microsoft. We had SQL Server 2000, which, to be fair, was just an awful, awful product. Why we needed a database that had a function called XP command shell that gave people command line access to a database, which was wormed, code red, and so on. and IIS 2, 3, and 4, which were awful products, and indeed XP, which was just hammered by anybody with a security mindset. So what he said about was in the Trustworthy Computing was he said, Trustworthy Computing is the highest priority for all the work that Microsoft was doing, right? So much so that it launched the whole security development lifecycle initiative that a lot of us are now familiar with SDLC. But 4 months before that, Mark Curphey launched OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project. Now, at the time when we were messing around with these newfangled web applications, right, there was no books, there was no guides, there was no security, anything really to say, listen, these are how you build secure applications, here's how you test them. So Mark started OWASP, and one of the first projects we got involved in was the OWASP testing guide, which is effectively the first ever web hacking book. And this was very much greenfield because when you were building these applications, there was no real documentation to say, this is how you test them, and this is how you make them a bit more secure. So these two initiatives in the space of 4 months really did set about changing how the application security industry grew and also gave it some kind of structure. Because before that, it was very much a hacker's paradise. Nobody really knew what we were doing. And to be honest, the bugs were vast. If you look, and I can remember my time writing a lot of the vulnerabilities and the exploits that we were using, IIS 4 to 5 had numerous bugs where it was buffer overflows, remote command execution, cross-site scripting, and so on. It's like the software itself was really, really bad. And as with anything, you can't build anything trustworthy on quicksand. So I liken a lot of the application security industry to where we're at currently with the industry. We're in the fourth revolution. Well, I see the same thing with application security. That brings me on to the first revolution, mechanization. Now, in the 90s, if you wanted to start attacking a lot of these new applications, which were HTML and CGI, you made use of a tool called Whisker. Now, Whisker was written by Rainforest Puppy, who, as I said before, very good web application hacker as such. And it was phenomenal because it was scriptable. So it was the first thing. It was very tailored to do a lot of flexible web scanning, which was really important. It was very stealthy because at the time, application security really struggled with encoding. And indeed, we still struggle today, right? And also, he wanted to slap around a lot of the vendors with their IDS technology, where he built in anti-IDS checks into the scanner. Now, a lot of people have probably never heard of Whisker, but I'm sure a lot of people have used a tool called Nikto. Nikto was released in December 2001, and it was a Perl, script that you could point it at a web application that would go through and tell you all the bad things. Well, Nikto actually relied on libwhisker for its core functionality. Now, this for me was one of the first real web application hacking tools out there until 2000, when an amazing tool called Achilles came out. Now, Achilles is the first ever man-in-the-middle web application proxy. And what this meant was you could force your browser to go through this and then intercept the traffic requests and responses going from your browser to the web application. And this kickstarted an entire industry. What was powerful about Achilles was before you either had various small little Perl scripts or other hacked together solutions, but you never had a mass produced solution that was easy to install that allowed both developers and attackers and everybody else to see the traffic interactions between the two. But it was pretty basic and primitive and so on. Sorry. What happened was in 2002, a tool called Exodus, written by a very good friend of mine, Rogan Dawes, was built. Now, Exodus was really important because it wasn't just a proxy, but it also allowed full interception and scanning, and more importantly, fuzzing. Fuzzing was the start of the application security world because now we could bring up a list of massive amounts of data and throw it at the application to see how it handles stuff. This was really important. Exodus didn't stay around for long. It moved on to WebScarab, which is a phenomenally well-known tool. And at the same time, there was another tool written by Dave Aitel called Spike Proxy. So what we saw was people, the tool makers, now building these amazing tools that allowed those involved in AppSec to start seeing traffic. And this was really important because if you look at the development side, it was not as advanced. Now, my personal experience was for the first .com, helping build a newfangled website called ft.com. And Me, like many others at the time, I was doing a lot of pen testing. It was never really called pen testing back then, but security engineering. And my task was to not only sling code and build stuff, but also try and break it. Now, how the FT.com was built was very indicative at the time of development, in that FT decided to use Lotus Notes, which is possibly the worst piece of software you could ever lay your hands on. But the journalist would write an article and it would save it in a Lotus Notes format. And my task was getting that from a Solaris box using my bash scripts into a format that used FTP, because what's the security's love, onto the Apache production server, which was Apache 0.9 at the time. And then we served it out to the world. There was absolutely no security. The only security that we had was making sure that the Solaris boxes were patched and hoping that the files themselves never got corrupted. What we didn't know at the time was a lot of these applications that we were pushing out to the web with CGI and everything else had no concept of checking validation and ensuring that the code was secure, could handle itself, and accessing the database. And at the time, we decided to use a brand new database called Oracle. It was billed as unbreakable. And when we were doing the testing, I was throwing lots of data at it using WebScarab, and I noticed I was getting a lot of Oracle errors back through the browser. Now, this was fascinating. I went through the lead dev and said, listen, I'm getting this. He was like, it's fine. What we're going to do is we will just stop the error messages from being shown. You know, this was kind of the mindset of the security at the time, in that it was just, let's hide it. Don't let people see it. And I think that shows as to how dev changed. So if we look at, development from a normal process back in the day, waterfall development, is that the way software was built was all about making sure you have the system requirements going all the way through to operations as one lovely long pipeline, right? I like to liken it as unicorn development, because we never had this mindset of there will always be bugs. They wanted to build a single product, a 1.0, and get it shipped out. Now, the problem lies here is that we never factored for people to actually test the code that was being pushed. And indeed, for a very long time, anybody involved in application security testing was always told to test the code just before the go live date. And the joke in the pen testing industry has always been, it goes live on the Friday, you're doing the test, and the report needs to be done by Thursday, which didn't leave a lot of time for understanding the problems that might have happened and how you might fix them. And this is where a big chunk of vulnerability started to come in, because what we saw at the time was that a lot of the security risks that we highlighted were always risk accepted. We'll deal with it if somebody decides to attack it. And that kind of set the scene for the next generation. Now, the second revolution for me saw the most amount of massive technological advancements in application security. It was the time when a lot of information was starting to be shared. On the left is a project called hack.coza. This was the first exploit sharing site that I was involved in, where we would share exploit code and tools to other people that kind of help them gain access to applications, but also help them break into applications. And on the right is that OWASP testing project. Now, the sole purpose of the OWASP testing project was to build a guide that taught people how to test web applications for fundamental flaws. Now, these could be flaws, anything from input validation to SQL injection to error handling to cryptography. But it was important because at the time, there was nothing like that. And the testing project kind of grew as a guidebook for anybody both developing and testing. Now, at the time, if you looked at any of the development teams out there, there was one missing factor, in that very rarely did you find anybody who had security experience involved in the application development lifecycle, involved in the various development projects at the time. Now, in 2004, this kind of changed. The lady on the right is a woman called Justine Bone. She is a phenomenal hacker. In the early days, she was very much involved in the reverse engineering, the exploit dev. But what she did at Bloomberg in 2004 was she created a team that not only were heavily involved in the application lifecycle of the bank, but also they did code and architecture reviews of all new development. This kind of set the scene for what others have now done, because they had a feed of all the new code committed into the repositories at the time, CVS and SVN and so on, and use that to prioritize what needed to be looked at. This, I've spoken to a lot of my peers and colleagues across the industry. It was kind of one of the first teams that ever actually did that. And that was 16 years ago. So this is when we started to realize our industry needs to grow up, because we can't just keep on slinging applications on the web where all of a sudden we were getting a lot of personal information. We were starting to create massive amounts of data sets of really valuable data that wasn't protected in any way. You couldn't no longer just patch the box and cross your fingers. You couldn't just rely on a firewall, because the web was evolving at such an amazing pace that legacy technology like firewalls was actually useless when it came to web applications on the internet. You couldn't just block port 80 or port 443. And there was the problem. The third revolution was when we kind of almost weaponized the whole industry. Now, prior to that, if you looked at security research, you genuinely had research that looked into both networking, hardware, some software, and daemons. Now, I sit on the Black Hat Review Board, and I went through all the archives. And the first time I can see an actual application security talk, one that was dedicated to this new application way of working, was in 2003. It was a talk by Kevin Spett, where he looked at Java decompilation and application security. This was very important because prior to that, it was always Solaris bugs this, Microsoft bugs that. But now the security research industry was looking at specifically web applications and the application lifecycle. And this was really important because generally what it meant was, after that, the floodgates would open. And indeed, in 2006, they did. So bear in mind, in 2003, we had one talk. In 2006, we had 11 talks, right? This is important because in 2006, Metasploit was released by HD. So network level hacking was still very big, but we now had 11 talks looking at various application security vulnerabilities. And also, more importantly, 2006 was when Paros proxy was released. So we now had a serious influx of people doing interesting things. And that leads me into the next one. In 2005, Stafford Stoddard released Burp Suite. Now, Burp Suite has become the de facto tool across the industry now, but it wasn't always that way. And we've gone from LibWhisker to Exodus to Paros to WebScarab and so on. And they all had various individual little tools, such as a proxy tool, a spider tool, an intruder, and so on. But what they didn't have was almost commercial gluing of all the components that made it very easy for non-technical people to use, such as developers and architects and so on. But also it allowed the ability to speed up your actual testing. Now, what was fascinating about Burp Suite is that it allowed passive spidering as you browse the website. So now you could just use it like a standard user in a UAT QA style function, and it would automatically collect that and build it into a special web application scanner. This was a massive breakthrough for application security because now all of a sudden we had tools that everybody could use. They weren't hacker tools. These were application security tools. And this is kind of where the industry sort of almost forked in a way from the deep and down hacking way to, oh, wow, we're now actually we're sort of grown up. Well, I'll use that term really lightly. Then amazing thing happened. The rise of DevOps, right? We had this amazing time when all of a sudden we were no longer looking at waterfall style development, but we had this agile way of working, right? We had continuous software development and IT operations. It was amazing. It was almost like a nirvana in the desert, right? We could shorten the whole system development lifecycle, and we could provide continuous delivery with high quality software. The problem is that we had some fairly rudimentary tools. For example, Jenkins. Now, I liken the three tools up there to the lifecycle of the mobile phone. So Jenkins for me, which was the first kind of CI/CD platform out there in 2011, was the old analog rotary telephone. It was great for its time. It's ugly. There's no doubt about it. It uses Groovy. It's not that secure. And it's very much the Marmite of the application security world because, like, you know, if you gain access to it, it's game over. But also it's now very old. And for me, Jenkins is the PHP of application security, or the cockroach. No matter what we do, we can't seem to kill off Jenkins. Then 2011, Circle CI came in, right? Initial versions. And then 2016, Circle CI for me was the second generation of CI/CD. Now, all of a sudden, we're starting to bring in security tools and we're starting to make life a lot easier. And this was the original iPhone of the day. It was a fantastic UI. It worked really well. And for once, it kind of tailored into the application security crowd where you could really build stuff quite easily. You mean when somebody checks code in, we could do something. And that was a great, great monumental move. And now, if we look at 2020, GitHub, there is no doubt that GitHub has become the de facto code slinging place in code repository. Now, when GitHub was acquired by Microsoft in 2018, every single person and their dog put on their tilted hat and said, you know what, they're going to destroy it, they're going to kill it. But what Microsoft gave GitHub was the complete power and money to build the next generation of CI/CD. And it's that next generation of CI/CD that for me has really pushed security. Because up until then, security had one major problem. Security loved to say no, right? Security was always about blocking. No, can't, won't, must, frustrate. If you went to a security team and said, I want to do this feature, generally security would say no, which is why a lot of the time security was never involved. And there's an amazing book written by Gene Kim called The Phoenix Project. And he has the quote that I've used in many talks. And it's information security is always flashing their badges at people and making urgent demands, regardless of the consequences to the rest of the organization, which is why we don't invite them to many meetings. I was part of that problem. I didn't understand that modern security is about saying, yes, we can do it. Let's see how we can make it secure. And indeed, if you look at this phase, this rather ugly phase of the industry, you can see where we made a lot of massive problems. For example, our application security tools didn't fit into the development lifecycle. We were still working in a waterfall way. We expected a version 1 of the product to happen, and then we would run it through a DAST that would take 6 to 8 hours to run, be full of false positives, and then present the developers with either PDF or another console to log into. We became part of the problem. It was slow, it was clunky, and indeed, a lot of the security tools out there at the time really struggled with modern development languages and processes. And this was really hard because now, 2010, 2012, the web became, well, pretty much like water, like electricity. It was just a thing we did, right? And then something really weird happened. Hackers became cool. And I don't know how the hell that happened. All of a sudden, we had movies being made about us. We had TV shows. Everybody was talking about hacking, right? It was on the BBC News. It was on every news thing. Hackers are stealing this. Hackers are stealing that. Security became mainstream. And I think this is the most important part, where we saw a massive shift in the perception of what the public wanted. No longer was security that outlier that was only really there in the background, but nobody saw it as an actual value proposition. People now wanted and indeed expected security in the products and the applications they were using. Take, for example, the iPhone. The iPhone became incredibly easy to use, that even your grand and granddad could, but it was also very secure. And it shifted how people started to see the value of security, but also how the industry itself had to change. And indeed, this was probably the hardest part. And this ties me into the fourth revolution. If we look at where we're at today, we're in such a different time and place compared to the 90s and early 2000s. We now have tooling like I've never seen before. I'm literally like that proverbial kid in the sweet shop because I now have tools that allow me to find bugs. And indeed, I've never stopped finding bugs and reporting bugs, but now I have tools that make my life so much easier. For example, VS Code, the simple IDE. Before, you had very traditional IDEs, Visual Studio, Eclipse, if you're that way inclined, or the other ones. They didn't really build into the whole automation security tools like VS Code has. What VS Code has done is open it up to people to build serious amounts of automation that fits into your IDE. For example, I want to run tools that scan my code for vulnerabilities that are open source and gives me feedback instantly without having to go to a different window. I get it done in the console itself. Tooling has changed drastically. If we look at the industry itself, we've moved from clunky, miserable SAST and DAST tools to SAST, DAST, IAST, SCA composition a lot. Like the whole tooling world has drastically changed. Then there's the automation side. We now have the idea of infrastructure as code. Everything is code. We can automate everything. And that's really important because when we can automate, we can make sure that it uses templates that are secure. So from Ansible to Terraform to GitHub Actions, it has now started to mean that we're now slinging slightly better code. We then have integration. I've talked about GitHub before, but GitHub truly, for me, is the pinnacle of application security today. Because if you look at what GitHub has done with Actions, effectively making CI/CD and automation like the iPhone experience, as in it's really easy to do, a couple of lines of YAML and you have an action. You have a GitHub marketplace where now everybody puts their stuff into the marketplace. This pushes forward the ability to do amazing things. And then finally, you have knowledge. If I look back into the 90s when we were doing this kind of thing, we really didn't have any information. Now today we have YouTube, we have Slack, we have Cons, we have all the other things that the kids use. Discord, which I will never understand as an old hacker now, like lots of stuff flying all over the place, but people use it. And I think this is where so much has changed. And what we're seeing is a distinct change as to how we build code. For example, we now have the concept of guardrails. Old security was always about blocking. No, can't, must, shouldn't. Terrible mistake. And I truly do regret ever being part of that. We now have the notion of guardrails. I'm going to let you sling your code, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that that code is slung in a secure manner. And we have things, for example, on the left, we have CodeQL. CodeQL is probably one of the most exciting products I've seen in the SaaS world to come out in a very long time, right? It uses a semantic engine. We have the ability to look for bugs, and it's finding some really amazing bugs. On the right, we have SemGrep, which is a free open source semantic scanning engine, which I'm heavily using. And it's just phenomenal because we're now able to make security tools available to everybody, regardless of cost. And that's always been one of the biggest problems. And what does this mean? Well, if you now look, we're starting to see more and more people using these free tools to find bugs. Bug bounties are all over the place. GitHub has put some serious money behind it. And anybody who finds bugs in common open source projects using CodeQL can actually get money. And this is really damn important because it means that we're knocking down the low-hanging bugs, the awful SQL injections, the CMS bugs, the cross-site scripting, the stuff that's kind of haunted the internet for a very long time. Hopefully, with this next generation of tooling and knowledge and understanding of how applications are built, and more importantly, fitting into the application lifecycle so that security is no longer seen as this weird, strange group of people who say no, but actually ones that want to help, we can start smashing bugs. Well, I say that. Yesterday, I decided to look for some of the most common bugs that are coming out. And it turns out the title might be No More Bugs, but in reality, we still have a lot of bugs. And we have a lot of things to do still. For example, when you have remote code execution in content management systems, or indeed a lot of the vendor-driven bugs in security products that should never, ever have existed. But hopefully, as you can see, the application security world is growing up. We're no longer the bunch of hackers that we used to be in the 90s breaking into stuff. We're now all about building tooling and experiences that make people sling code much better. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon.